Hello, welcome back to the Phantom Diary channel. I'm sure there are many of you listening to my stories to fall asleep. Before we start, write in the comments what country you're listening from. If you feel fear, you should like and subscribe this channel. So, let's go. I never believed in the Loch Ness Monster. My grandfather used to tell me stories about it when I was a kid, how he swore he saw something massive moving through the mist when he was younger. I always chalked it up to an old man's imagination. But that was before I saw it myself. It was late autumn when I visited the loch, the water dark and endless under a heavy sky. The tourists were gone for the season, and I had the shoreline all to myself. I had come for photography. Mist rolling. Over the black water, skeletal trees reflected in the surface. It was hauntingly beautiful. I was setting up my tripod near the edge when I saw the first ripple. Not the kind a fish makes, not even the slow current of the loch, but something deeper, heavier. The water shifted unnaturally, like something enormous had just moved beneath it. I froze, camera in hand. The air felt unnaturally still. No birds, no wind, just silence. Then a shape rose from the water. It was slow, deliberate. A long, dark mass broke the surface, a thick, ridged form, slick with water. My breath caught as I saw it continue to rise, towering above the loch. A neck, impossibly long, curved upward, dripping as it swayed slightly. The head was small compared to the rest of it, but its eyes, black and glassy, locked onto me. I wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at me to move, but my legs wouldn't work. I just stood there, clutching my camera as the thing watched me. Then, without a sound, it slipped back beneath the surface. Not a splash, not a ripple. Just gone, swallowed by the loch as if it had never been there. I waited, heart hammering, but the water remained still. I finally exhaled, shaking as I looked down at my camera, desperate to see if I had caught it. My hands trembled as I scrolled through the shots. Nothing. The frames showed only empty water, mist curling over the black surface. No shape, no eyes, nothing. I didn't sleep that night. I kept hearing the water in my head, the deep silence of the loch, the way it had looked at me. I left at dawn. I don't tell people what I saw. No one would believe me anyway. But I know the truth. The loch is watching, and something in it is still waiting. I've always been fascinated by Loch Ness. Growing up, I'd read countless stories about the elusive creature said to dwell in its murky waters, but I never believed the legends until I saw it for myself. It was a calm spring evening when I decided to visit the loch, having heard a small boat tour was available for those interested in a Nessie experience. I was on vacation, with nothing but time on my hands, and the weather was perfect. Clear skies, a light breeze, and the sun just beginning to dip behind the hills. My boat guide, an older man named Callum, seemed jaded by the constant flood of tourists, but he was pleasant enough. We set out on the water as the boat gently rocked. Callum told us a few stories about the loch's history, its myths, and how many people claimed to have spotted something. He made it clear he didn't put much stock in those tales, but he humored the tourists, pointing to distant spots where alleged sightings occurred. I didn't expect to see anything. But as we floated further from the shore, something started to change. The water wasn't as smooth anymore. A slight ripple spread outward, far beyond the range of our boat, as if something large was moving beneath the surface. "Calm down, folks. It's just the wind," Callum said, but I could see the unease in his eyes. I stared into the water, the deep green surface shimmering in the fading light. There was something off about the way it moved. A part of me knew I should look away, but I couldn't. I felt drawn to it. Then, as I focused harder, I saw it. At first, it was just a ripple, no more than a shadow that slipped beneath the surface. I blinked, thinking I was imagining it. But then it rose. Slowly, the water parting, like a curtain. A long neck covered in dark, slick scales emerged. My breath caught in my throat. It was massive. The creature, if that's what it was, moved so gracefully it was almost like it was made of the water itself. Its head broke the surface next, large and elongated, with eyes that gleamed with a golden sheen. I could see every detail: the dark ridges along its neck, the movement of its massive body beneath the water, the way it seemed to glide through the depths. It was real. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The boat rocked slightly, but everything else was silent. No birds, no wind, nothing. Just the sound of my heartbeat pounding in my ears. "Callum," I whispered, too afraid to speak any louder. "Look." He turned, following my gaze. His face went pale. Without a word, he grabbed the throttle and revved the engine, trying to speed us away from the creature. But it wasn't fast enough. The creature, with unnatural speed, surged toward us, breaking the water's surface with a force that sent a wave crashing against the side of the boat. My heart dropped into my stomach as it closed the distance between us in seconds. I could see the massive body beneath the surface, a dark, undulating shape that followed the boat. Callum cursed under his breath, pushing the throttle harder. The boat lurched forward, and the creature, for a moment, seemed to lose interest. I caught a glimpse of its tail flicking below, like an enormous serpent vanishing beneath the water. I glanced back at the loch, my mind racing. Was it truly Nessie? The Loch Ness Monster? Or something else? Something even worse? Callum didn't say a word for the rest of the ride, his face grim and pale. We made it back to the dock, and without a word, he helped us off the boat, eyes constantly scanning the water. I wanted to say something, to ask him what that was, but I didn't. He looked terrified, and I couldn't find the words. I don't know what I saw that day. The creature had vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only ripples behind. But when I looked into the loch that night from my hotel window, I could swear I saw something moving beneath the surface. A shadow in the dark. Something that was watching, waiting. Maybe it was Nessie. Maybe it wasn't. But whatever it was real, and it was still out there. I've always been skeptical about the Loch Ness Monster. Growing up, I thought it was just folklore, a story told to entertain or to attract tourists. But after what happened to me, I don't think that anymore. It was a cold, overcast afternoon when I found myself on the shores of Loch Ness, just outside the town. I had been traveling through Scotland, taking in the sights when I decided to visit the lake. The fog rolled over the water, thick and heavy, and the chill in the air felt almost unnatural. There were a few tourists around, but it wasn't crowded. I wandered down a narrow path along the lake, hoping to get some solitude. I stood at the water's edge, staring out into the mist, wondering what it would be like to actually see something in the depths of the loch. I had heard all the stories, but I never really believed. And then something caught my eye. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light or the fog, but as I watched, I realized it was much bigger than I initially thought. A ripple formed in the water, spreading out in large, undulating waves, like something huge was moving beneath the surface. My heart started to race. The waves continued, but the shape beneath them was becoming clearer. A long, dark shape moving slowly through the murky water. It wasn't a boat, and it wasn't a fish. It was too large, too fluid. My breath caught in my throat. I knew instantly what I was looking at: the Loch Ness Monster. I felt a wave of panic wash over me, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The creature's back was visible for just a moment, long and smooth, like a giant serpent moving beneath the surface. Then the shape vanished, sinking back into the depths. I stood frozen, my heart thumping in my chest. For a moment, I questioned my sanity. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was just an illusion caused by the fog. But then, the water rippled again, this time much closer. A massive head emerged from the water, its long, snake-like neck stretching up to the sky. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The creature's eyes were dark and glossy, its gaze cold and calculating. For a moment, it just stared at me, as if it were assessing whether I was a threat. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. All I could do was watch as the creature's long neck rose further, its mouth opening slightly, revealing rows of sharp teeth. Though it didn't seem to be threatening me, it was simply observing, waiting. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but I knew I couldn't. This was happening, and I had to witness it. Then, as quickly as it appeared, the creature's head dipped back beneath the water, and the ripples faded into calm once more. The mist around the loch began to thicken, and the normal sounds of the world returned. Birds in the distance, the wind brushing against the trees. But the creature was gone. I stumbled backward, my hands trembling. I couldn't process what I had just seen. I turned and made my way back to the small parking area, my legs weak, my head spinning. As I reached the car, I looked back one last time at the loch, now eerily quiet. There was nothing there, no sign of what I had witnessed. The water was still and calm. I've never told anyone what I saw that day. Who would believe me? They'd think I was just another person caught up in the myth. But I know what I saw. The Loch Ness Monster is real, and it's out there, hidden in the depths, waiting. I've never gone back to the loch, and I never will. But every time I see a ripple in water, I can't help but remember that moment. The dark shape moving beneath the surface, and the creature that looked right into my soul. It was supposed to be a peaceful vacation. Just me, my camera, and a cabin by the loch. The weather had been perfect that week in the Scottish Highlands, and after a long drive, I finally settled into the small wooden cabin overlooking the waters of Loch Ness. I had always been fascinated by the stories of the Loch Ness Monster, but I never thought much of them. They were just stories, folklore passed down through generations. But as I stood by the lake, I couldn't deny the strange allure the place had. I spent most of my days hiking the trails, exploring the cliffs, and taking pictures of the loch. The mist, the ancient trees, and the occasional cries of distant birds created a haunting atmosphere that felt timeless. But on my last day there, something happened that I couldn't explain. It was late in the afternoon when I decided to take one last stroll along the edge of the loch. The water was still, reflecting the sky perfectly, making it look like a massive mirror. As I walked, I noticed the light was starting to fade, the sun sinking lower in the sky. That's when I saw it. Something moving beneath the surface of the water. At first, I thought it was just a log or a school of fish, but then I saw the shape. A large, dark silhouette that cut through the water in a way I had never seen before. It was too big to be anything ordinary. My heart raced and I froze, staring out at the water. The creature, whatever it was, moved slowly, gliding just below the surface. Its shape was hard to make out, but there was no mistaking its long, undulating body. For a moment, I thought it was a boat, but the movement was wrong. Too fluid, too alive. And then, it surfaced. I could barely believe my eyes. A massive head, dark and serpentine, emerged from the water, followed by a thick, writhing neck. The creature's eyes, if you could call them that, were large and dark, staring straight at me with an almost human intelligence. It had a body that seemed to stretch and curl, like a giant serpent, and fins that rippled along its sides. The water around it rippled violently as it moved, sending small waves crashing against the rocks. I could feel my breath catch in my throat. The Loch Ness Monster. I had heard the stories, seen the blurry photos, but never in my wildest dreams. Did I think I'd actually see it? It was surreal, like something out of a nightmare, but it was real. It was right there in front of me. I fumbled for my camera, trying to capture the moment, but my hands were shaking too much to get a steady shot. The creature didn't seem to care about me at all. It lingered on the surface for a few seconds, its head rising higher, and then it slowly sank back below the water, disappearing into the depths with hardly a ripple. My heart pounded in my chest. I could hardly breathe. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my mind trying to make sense of what I had just witnessed. I knew I had to leave, but my legs felt frozen in place. The silence of the loch pressed in on me, the water eerily calm again. It was like nothing had happened, but I knew what I had seen. I snapped a few pictures, blurry, rushed, shaky, but I couldn't look at them. I knew no one would believe me, and honestly, I wasn't sure I believed it myself. But the memory of those eyes, those deep, ancient eyes staring at me, stayed with me long after I left the shores of Loch Ness. When I returned to the cabin, I packed my things in a daze, hardly able to focus. The sun was setting, and the loch looked completely different now. Quiet, still, as if it were hiding something beneath its surface. I couldn't help but glance back one last time, and that's when I saw it again. A dark shape broke the surface of the water in the distance. For a moment, I thought it was just my imagination, but there it was, gliding through the loch, disappearing beneath the waves. I didn't stay another night. It had been a dream of mine to visit Loch Ness. As a child, I'd heard the tales, seen the documentaries, and read the stories about the legendary creature that supposedly lived in the deep, murky waters. But I never truly believed it. Not really. I thought it was just a myth, something to capture the imagination of tourists. But everything changed that night. I had been traveling through Scotland, hiking and exploring when I arrived at Loch Ness. The lake stretched out before me, vast and eerie in the fading light. The mist rolled in from the mountains, hanging over the water like a shroud, and a sense of isolation settled over the landscape. I didn't expect anything strange to happen, but the moment I set up camp by the shore, something felt off. The air was thick with tension, almost like the earth itself was holding its breath. That evening, I took a walk along the shoreline, staring out at the still water, my thoughts lost in the quiet beauty of the place. The legends of the Loch Ness Monster, Nessie as she was called, floated in my mind like old echoes. But I was sensible, a rational person. It was just a big, deep lake. Nothing more. As the evening deepened, the sun dipped below the horizon, and the loch was bathed in shadows. I began to head back to camp when I heard a faint noise, a strange hum, like a distant engine. But there was no boat or person in sight. I paused, listening. The sound grew louder, vibrating through the air. My heart began to race, an instinctive unease creeping over me. Then, from the water, something broke the surface. At first, it was just a ripple, subtle, like a shadow swimming beneath the water. But then it emerged fully, slowly and silently, a dark shape rising from the depths. I froze, my breath caught in my chest. It was massive. The thing that surfaced was long, serpentine. The water shimmered around it, but the shape was unmistakable. A large, hump-backed creature. My heart pounded as I stared, my legs rooted to the ground. This wasn't a log or an eel, it was something alive, something ancient. The creature's long, sinuous neck arched out of the water, stretching toward the sky. I could see the outline of its head, a strange, elongated shape, and two dark, unblinking eyes that glinted in the twilight. They were not the eyes of any animal I'd ever seen. They were intelligent, knowing. I didn't dare move. My body was frozen, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. Was this real? Was this some trick of the light? But no, this was no trick. The creature slowly turned its head, its enormous form rippling beneath the surface of the water. It wasn't rushing, but moving deliberately, as if aware of my presence, aware that I was watching. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, it submerged, its body disappearing into the blackness of the loch. The water calmed almost immediately, leaving no trace of the monster that had just risen from its depths. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the water. The hum, the vibrations, had stopped. It was as if nothing had happened at all. But I knew better. My heart was still racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just witnessed something beyond my understanding. I didn't go back to the camp that night. Instead, I found myself walking around the loch's edge, trying to make sense of what I had seen. The shadows of the night grew deeper, and the mist rolled in thicker. But all I could think about was that creature, the Loch Ness Monster. When dawn finally broke, I returned to the camp, shaken, exhausted, but knowing that what I had seen was real. I packed up quickly, eager to leave the loch behind. As I walked to my car, I glanced back one last time, my eyes scanning the water. For a moment, I thought I saw a ripple in the distance, but when I blinked, it was gone. I never believed in the Loch Ness Monster, at least not until I saw it with my own eyes. It was a crisp fall day when I went to Loch Ness, just me and my camera looking to explore the area. My friends had all laughed when I told them I was going there, saying I was chasing myths. I didn't mind. I wasn't going to find Nessie, but I figured the scenery would be enough. I arrived at the lake just as the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the water. The loch, massive and dark, seemed to stretch endlessly before me. I stood on the shore for a long while, lost in the stillness. The silence was almost unnerving, nothing but the occasional ripple from the water and the faint cry of a bird in the distance. I started walking along the shoreline, taking some pictures of the mist rising off the water. As the evening grew colder, I noticed the water becoming increasingly restless, as if disturbed by something beneath the surface. But it was only a few ripples at first, nothing I couldn't explain away. A fish, maybe, or the wind. But then, I saw it. A shape emerged from the water, large and dark, moving slowly toward the shore. It was too big to be a fish and too odd to be anything familiar. The ripples spread out, widening, as if something massive had just breached the surface. My heart started to race. I stepped back, my camera still in my hand, but I couldn't move. The creature, if that's what it was, rose further from the water. It had a long, serpentine body that undulated beneath the surface, a shadow that seemed to shift with every movement. Then something even stranger. A massive, elongated neck slowly rose above the water. I froze. The neck was impossibly long, covered in scales that glistened in the dim light. It curved, and with a sudden movement, the head of the creature broke the surface. Its eyes, deep and black like the abyss, locked onto mine. For a moment, we just stared at each other. The air was thick with tension, as though time itself had stopped. I knew it was the Loch Ness Monster, or whatever it was. No rational thought could explain what I was seeing. I felt my body tense up, adrenaline surging through me. I wanted to run, but my feet were glued to the spot. The creature's massive body rippled as it moved closer to the shore, the water around it swirling with unnatural force. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it stopped. The creature's eyes seemed to narrow, almost as if it was studying me, judging me. I couldn't tear my gaze away. The world felt still, too still. There was no wind, no sound, just the creature and me. And the loch, the dark, oppressive loch that felt alive, watching us both. I couldn't breathe. I felt like I was intruding on something ancient, something powerful that had been hidden in the depths for eons. And yet, despite the terror bubbling up in my chest, I couldn't look away. The creature let out a low, rumbling sound that shook through the ground beneath my feet. It wasn't a roar or a growl. It was almost like a hum, a vibration that seemed to come from deep within the creature's massive form. Before I could react, it began to move again, slowly sinking back into the water. The ripples grew wider, and the water seemed to swallow the creature whole. I blinked, and within seconds the surface of the loch was calm again. No trace of the beast remained. The water was still, as if nothing had happened. I stood there, my hands shaking, trying to process what I had just seen. Was it real? Had I imagined it? The camera in my hand was still pointing at the spot, but there was no evidence on the screen. Nothing but a photo of the dark water. No creature. No Loch Ness Monster. I left the shore immediately, my mind reeling with what I'd just witnessed. The walk back to my car felt like a blur, my thoughts consumed by the image of those black, deep eyes staring at me. And yet, despite everything I had seen, I couldn't bring myself to tell anyone what had happened. The few times I tried to speak of it, the words felt hollow, as if no one would believe me. After all, who would? Who would believe that they saw the Loch Ness Monster, the very thing dismissed as a myth? Even now, years later, I sometimes wonder if it was real, or if it was just a figment of my imagination. But every time I close my eyes, I can still see those eyes, those dark, endless eyes watching me from the depths of the loch. And I know what I saw. It started as a dream, an escape from the stress of life, a trip to the famous Loch Ness in the Scottish Highlands. I've always been fascinated by the legend, the stories of the creature lurking beneath the murky waters, but I didn't believe it. Not really. I just thought it would be cool to visit the place where people claim to have seen it. I rented a small cabin near the loch, far enough away from the busy tourist spots. The weather was typical for the area. Misty mornings, cool evenings with clouds that seemed to hug the mountain peaks. The silence of the loch was almost overwhelming. Not a sound, except the occasional cry of a bird or the splash of water when a fish broke the surface. The first few days were uneventful. I spent most of my time walking around the shore, reading in the cabin, and taking photos. The loch seemed peaceful, almost too calm, as if hiding something beneath its depths. On the fourth day, something changed. It was just before dusk. The sky had turned a dull orange, and I was sitting on a bench near the water's edge, watching the light dance across the surface of the loch. I was thinking about leaving the next day when something caught my eye, a ripple on the water, bigger than anything I had seen before. It wasn't a breeze, because the air was still, and it didn't look like the kind of wake a boat would make either. I squinted into the distance, where the ripple was. The water seemed to churn slightly in a circular pattern. Then it stopped. I stood up, my heart rate picking up. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but then I saw it. A dark shape, long and undulating, surfaced near the center of the loch. It was too big to be a log or a fish. The shape twisted and turned as it glided through the water, moving with an unnatural grace. My stomach dropped. The thing was massive, at least 30 feet long. It had a sleek body, almost serpentine, with a thick neck that extended above the water, and something that looked like a hump on its back. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I didn't dare move, too terrified to even blink. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. It couldn't be the Loch Ness Monster. That was a myth, a story. But what I was looking at was real. The shape moved closer to the shore, just out of reach, and then, for a moment, it stopped. It was as if it knew I was watching. A shadowed head appeared above the water, and for a moment its glowing eyes locked with mine. It felt like it was studying me, observing me, like it was weighing whether or not I was a threat. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the creature submerged again, disappearing into the depths with barely a ripple. My legs felt like jelly as I stumbled backward, away from the loch. I was shaking, my hands clammy, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do. I thought about running to the cabin, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the water, expecting it to resurface any second. My mind raced, torn between disbelief and the raw terror of what I had just witnessed. I didn't know how long I stood there, staring at the loch, but when I finally turned to leave, the shadows had already begun to stretch across the water. The creature was gone. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that I had seen a large fish or perhaps a submerged tree trunk. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. There was no mistaking it. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still see its eyes, glowing faintly in the water, watching me. I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, unable to shake the image of that massive, undulating form beneath the surface. The next morning, I left the cabin early. I didn't want to stay another minute near the loch. As I packed my car, I glanced out at the water one last time. The loch seemed so calm, so peaceful, but I knew better now. It was hiding something. As I drove away, I could have sworn I saw a shape break the surface of the water one last time, far in the distance. But I didn't stop. I didn't want to see it again. I never told anyone what happened that night. Some things are better left unspoken. But I know what I saw, and I'll never forget the way it watched me. It was supposed to be a quiet vacation, a week in the Scottish Highlands with my best friend, Jake. We had always talked about visiting Loch Ness, partly for the history, partly for the legend. I didn't believe in the Loch Ness Monster, but I was still curious. The idea of seeing something so infamous was too exciting to pass up. We arrived at the loch in the late afternoon, the water dark and glassy, stretching out under a cloudy sky. The air was cool, the kind of crisp that makes you feel alive. After grabbing a quick lunch in the nearby village, we set out toward the lake. The area around the loch was serene, almost too quiet. There were only a handful of tourists, and the faint sound of birds echoed through the hills. We rented a small boat to take out onto the water. The plan was simple. Just relax, enjoy the view, and maybe take a few photos. I wasn't expecting anything unusual, but as the boat drifted farther from shore, the mood began to shift. The clouds thickened and the air grew colder. Jake and I sat in silence, gazing out at the vastness of Loch Ness. The water seemed almost unnatural in its stillness, like it was holding something beneath its surface. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Then it happened. At first, it was just a ripple, barely noticeable like the flick of a fish's tail. I wasn't sure if it was the wind or something more. But then the ripples grew larger, closer to the boat. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice tight. Jake squinted at the water. "Yeah, I saw it." We both stared at the dark water, the surface shifting unnaturally. The ripples spread out in perfect circles. My heart started to race. Suddenly, a large, dark shape emerged from the water. I froze. It was huge, far larger than anything I had expected. The shape was long and serpentine, its body twisting in and out of the water. For a moment, I thought I might be dreaming. But no, this was real. Jake was the first to speak, his voice shaky. That's not a log." The creature moved slowly, almost methodically, its body rising and falling like a snake gliding through the water. I could see a large hump, and then a long, smooth neck stretching high above the surface. My heart pounded. There it was, the Loch Ness Monster. The creature's eyes were black, large, and almost unblinking as it seemed to glance in our direction. I swear I could feel its gaze. A chill ran down my spine. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. We didn't move. We didn't say anything. The creature, however, seemed to notice us now. It swam closer, the water rippling with its massive movements. The boat rocked gently as the waves grew stronger. For a moment, I thought it might approach us directly. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the creature submerged. The water calmed almost instantly, leaving behind only ripples that slowly faded into nothing. We sat there in stunned silence for what felt like an eternity. I couldn't process what I had just seen. My mind refused to believe it, even though I knew it was the truth. "What the hell was that?" Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. I couldn't speak. I was still staring at the spot where the creature had vanished, expecting it to reappear at any second. But it didn't. "Let's get back to shore," I said, my voice trembling. We quickly started the engine and headed back to the shore, neither of us saying anything more. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see the dark shape rise from the water again, but nothing happened. When we reached the dock, I felt like my legs were going to give out. I stepped onto solid ground, but the sight of the calm loch still haunted me. We didn't talk much on the drive back to our cabin, both of us processing what we'd witnessed. When we finally spoke, it was Jake who broke the silence. "You think anyone will believe us?" he asked. I shook my head. "No one will believe us?" "Not really." That night, neither of us slept much. I lay awake, listening to the sounds of the forest outside, but all I could think about was the creature in the water and that cold, calculating stare. I had always been fascinated by the myths surrounding the place. Everyone knows about the Loch Ness Monster, but I had never really believed it was real. I figured it was just another piece of local folklore, a story told to keep tourists coming. I arrived at the lake on a cool, misty evening, with the sun dipping behind the hills. The water was smooth, almost unnaturally still, as though the entire lake were holding its breath. I rented a small boat from a local shop, eager to explore the place and see the lake from a new perspective. There weren't many people around, just a few tourists scattered along the shoreline, their voices lost to the wind. I pushed off from the dock and drifted out into the center of the lake, letting the boat sway gently with the ripples. The silence was almost overwhelming, save for the occasional bird call and the faint sound of water lapping against the hull. I was about 200 yards from shore when I first noticed it. At first, I thought it was just a wave, but the water didn't ripple like it should have. It was too controlled. A long, dark shape moved beneath the surface, gliding slowly. My heart skipped a beat, and I leaned forward, squinting through the mist. It was large, much larger than any fish I had ever seen, and it wasn't the shape of any boat, log, or anything that could be mistaken for an object floating in the water. It was long and sinuous, and I could make out what appeared to be a head rising from the water, a sleek, almost serpentine neck. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it. But then, the creature surfaced again. This time, it was closer, just beneath the waterline, its massive body barely breaking the surface. The head was unmistakable, elongated, with dark, deep eyes that seemed to shimmer even in the dimming light. It moved slowly, cautiously, like it was aware of my presence. My pulse raced. I wanted to scream, to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. I couldn't take my eyes off it. The creature seemed to glide effortlessly through the water, its neck stretching upward before it submerged again, disappearing into the deep blackness of the loch. I wasn't sure how long I stared at it. Time felt like it had stopped. I glanced around. There were no other boats in sight, no people, just me and whatever was lurking beneath the surface. I should have left. I should have turned the boat around and rowed back to the shore. But something held me there. Curiosity, maybe. Or the fact that I had never been so close to something that could be the legendary Loch Ness Monster. Then, without warning, the surface of the water erupted. The beast, or whatever it was, surged from the depths in one fluid motion. The entire boat rocked as the water splashed violently, and I gripped the sides, fearing I would capsize. The creature's massive body twisted and turned in the water like a living, writhing serpent. I saw a thick tail flick behind it, sending waves in every direction. It was all too much, too real. For a moment, it was as if time stood still. The creature's head rose high above the water, and I could see its mouth opening, revealing rows of sharp teeth. My stomach turned, a surge of panic rising in my chest. I had heard about the stories, tales of giant creatures seen from a distance, blurry photographs, distant shadows. But this was no blurry photo. This was no distant myth. I was seeing it with my own eyes. I didn't know what to do. My heart pounded in my ears. The beast didn't seem to be attacking. No, it was just watching me, its dark eyes unblinking. I held my breath, not wanting to make a sound. But then, as quickly as it had appeared, it sank back into the depths of the loch, disappearing beneath, the water with barely a ripple. I sat in stunned silence. The lake was calm again. The only evidence that anything had happened was the swirling water where the creature had been moments before. With trembling hands, I grabbed the oars and began, rowing back to shore. Every few strokes, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting the creature to appear again. The fog had thickened, and the world around me felt suffocating, almost unreal. When I reached the dock, I hurriedly tied the boat and ran to the car, not daring to look back. As I drove away, I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror, my heart still racing. I never spoke of it again to anyone. I couldn't. Who would believe me? But that night, as I lay in bed in my rented cottage, I couldn't shake the feeling that the Loch Ness Monster had been watching me. Not out of curiosity, but because it knew I had seen it. And maybe, just maybe, it wanted me to remember. I had always been skeptical of the Loch Ness Monster. Growing up, I heard the stories. People swearing they'd seen something massive rise from the water, but it all seemed like myth to me. A tall tale to entertain tourists. But that all changed, one summer during a solo trip to the Scottish Highlands. I had rented a small cottage near Loch Ness, hoping to clear my head after a rough year. The tranquil water, the distant hills, and the quiet of the countryside seemed like the perfect setting to escape. My days consisted of long walks along the shore, reading books in the evening, and occasionally chatting with locals who were more than happy to talk about the Nessie sightings that brought tourists to the area. On the fourth day of my stay, something changed. It was a crisp, cloudy morning when I decided to take my camera and walk down to the loch's edge. The air was thick with mist, and the surface of the water was calm, barely a ripple in sight. There were no boats, no tourists, just the occasional call of birds overhead. It was quiet, too quiet. I stood by the shore for what seemed like hours, staring out at the water, and that's when I saw it, a shadow. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but no, it was moving, slowly, deliberately, just beneath the surface. Something massive, long, and undulating. It couldn't be a log. Logs don't move like that. My heart began to race. I watched, frozen, as the shadow glided further into view. A long neck, almost serpentine, curved above the waterline before dipping back down, disappearing just as quickly as it had appeared. I couldn't breathe. I fumbled for my camera, my hands trembling. My mind was a whirl of disbelief and adrenaline. There it was, the Loch Ness Monster, right in front of me, after all these years of skepticism. I aimed my camera at the spot where the shadow had been, but the moment I pressed the shutter, the water exploded. The surface churned violently as if something enormous had just risen from the depths. The splash was deafening, and I staggered back, my feet slipping on the wet rocks. In that split second, I saw it, a massive shape, its dark body towering above the water. The creature's long neck arced like a bridge, its skin slick and glistening, with moisture. Its head, large and imposing, turned towards me, eyes glimmering like pools of black ink. For a moment I locked eyes with it, and in that instant I felt a chill deep in my bones, a primal fear that surged through me. It didn't make a sound, no roar, no splash, just a heavy silence that hung in the air. Before I could process what was happening, the creature dipped beneath the water, vanishing just as quickly as it had appeared. The loch fell silent once more, as if nothing had ever happened. The water was still again, the mist swirling gently across the surface, hiding any trace of the beast. I stood there, heart pounding, trying to steady my breath. I didn't know what to do. Should I tell someone? Would they even believe me? I looked at the camera in my hand. The photo I had taken, the one that might have captured the creature, was blank. No shadow, no shape, just a perfectly ordinary shot of the loch. I stayed by the shore for another hour, hoping the creature would reappear, but it never did. The stillness of the water seemed mocking in its quiet. That evening, I spoke to a local fisherman at a pub. He told me the same old story about how Nessie had been spotted for centuries, and how some people, including himself, had seen strange things in the water. But when I mentioned what I had witnessed that morning, his expression changed. "You're not the first to see it," he said quietly, lowering his voice. "But the Loch Ness Monster doesn't like to be seen. It only reveals itself to those who truly believe, or those who are foolish enough to think they can find it." I laughed nervously, unsure whether he was being serious or just playing along with the legends. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. The next morning, I packed up and left the cottage early. I didn't want to stay another moment by that cursed loch. As I walked away from the water, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't been alone for the past week, that something was still watching me from the depths, waiting for the next fool to wander too close to its domain. It wasn't supposed to be anything out of the ordinary. A quiet trip to Loch Ness, just me and my cousin Ben, exploring the infamous waters of the Scottish Highlands. We'd been hearing about the Loch Ness Monster for years, like most people, but never took it seriously. It was a legend, a myth, something for tourists to cling to. We rented a small boat for the day, hoping to enjoy the peaceful, mist-covered lake. The weather was typical, cloudy and overcast with a faint drizzle of rain. The kind of day where the Loch Ness waters look more like a mystery than a vacation spot. Ben, who was more of a skeptic than I was laughing at the idea of spotting the creature. "I bet the only monsters out here are the fish," he said, his voice carrying across the stillness. The boat rocked gently as we paddled deeper into the loch, leaving behind the small boat docks and the few tourists who had ventured out this far. The mist started to thicken, wrapping itself around the trees along the shore. The eerie silence of the place settled over us like a heavy blanket. And that's when it happened. We were about halfway across the loch when I saw it. At first, it was nothing but a ripple in the water, barely noticeable. I didn't say anything, immediately, thinking it was just a trick of the mist or the wind. But then, the ripple grew, expanding outward, as if something large and heavy was moving just below the surface. I leaned over the side of the boat, staring into the dark, murky water. The ripples came again, this time much closer. It was like something, or someone, was pushing through the depths. "Ben," I said, my voice shaking, "do you see that?" Ben was busy checking his phone, half interested. "See what?" The water in front of us started to churn, a dark shape moving. Beneath, a long, massive shape. It was too big to be a fish, too smooth to be a log. The water itself seemed to shift in unnatural ways, swirling in a pattern that didn't match the wind or the rain. My heart pounded in my chest. "Ben! Look!" He finally turned, following my frantic gaze. The moment he saw it, his face went pale. Whatever we were seeing, he knew it wasn't normal. The shape broke the surface, slowly at first, and then, my breath caught in my throat. A long neck rose from the depths, followed by a massive head with a dark, glossy surface. It was something I could never have prepared for. The creature's eyes glinted like black marbles, and the sheer size of it was incomprehensible. It moved with a grace that contradicted its enormous size, its neck swaying like a serpent's, and I could hear the faintest sound of splashing as it turned its massive head toward us. For a moment there was silence between us and the creature, both of us frozen in disbelief. The mist had parted, and the dark figure loomed above the water, its body slowly rising, revealing a back that looked like a mountain ridge, slick with the wetness of the loch. Holy, Ben whispered, barely audible. My entire body went cold, but my legs refused to move. I was paralyzed with fear, and yet there was an overwhelming, almost magnetic pull to look at it. It felt wrong, like I was intruding on something ancient, something that didn't want to be found. Then, in a slow, deliberate motion, the creature dipped back beneath the water, vanishing from sight as if it had never existed. The ripples faded, and the water once again became unnervingly calm. I don't know how long we sat there, staring at the spot where the creature had disappeared. Ben was shaking, his face pale, his lips pressed tight. "What the hell was that?" he muttered. I had no words. I couldn't even process what I had seen. We didn't stay much longer after that. We rowed back to the shore as fast as we could, hardly speaking, the mist swirling around us like a veil. When we reached the docks, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. It was as if the loch itself had swallowed the truth, and now we were free. Neither of us mentioned the creature again once we were back in the safety of the town, surrounded by the humdrum of everyday life. But every time I close my eyes, I still see that enormous neck rising from the dark water. I can hear the slow, deliberate ripples like a warning. I don't know what we saw that day, but I do know one thing. There's something in the depths of Loch Ness, and it's waiting. It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway. My girlfriend, Claire, and I decided to spend a few days in Scotland, exploring the Highlands and, of course, visiting Loch Ness. We'd heard the legends, of course. Who hasn't? But we didn't expect anything out of the ordinary. Just a boat ride, a few pictures, and the typical tourist experience. We'd arrived at the loch early in the morning. Mist hung low over the water, wrapping the surface in an eerie veil. It was quiet, almost too quiet, the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're not alone. We rented a small boat from a local operator and set off, heading toward the darker, more secluded part of the loch. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the misty sky and the rugged hills that surrounded the area. We laughed about the ridiculous stories of the Loch Ness Monster, making jokes and taking pictures as we drifted farther from the shore. The boat moved slowly, the motor humming quietly as we watched the water. The mist began to thicken, and the further we went, the less we could see of the shoreline. It was as if the loch was swallowing us whole, leaving only the space between us and the dark, endless water. Claire noticed the sudden stillness first. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice tense. I stopped talking and listened. The usual sounds of the wind, the occasional bird, the gentle lapping of water against the boat. Nothing. It was silent, almost suffocatingly so. My heart rate quickened, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. "I don't hear anything," I said, my voice low, unsure. But then, as if in response, something broke the surface of the water. A shadow. It was huge, long, too long. It moved beneath the water, ripples spreading outward, stretching in unnatural directions. I froze. Claire looked at me, eyes wide, but before either of us could speak, the shadow surged again, and this time it was closer. I could barely make out the shape, something large and serpentine, with what looked like a massive fin breaking the surface, cutting through the water with smooth, almost fluid movements. The outline was unmistakable. My heart pounded in my chest, and I found myself gripping the sides of the boat, unable to look away. "Do you see that?" Claire breathed, her voice a mix of awe and fear. I nodded, too terrified to speak. The shape moved again, circling beneath us, and I felt the boat shift with the currents as if something massive was swimming underneath. Then, with a sudden, powerful thrust, something immense rose from the depths, towering above the water. It was impossible. The creature was enormous. Its long neck stretched up from the loch, a thick, dark form with smooth, glistening skin and eyes that gleamed, reflecting the dim light. It had the shape of a prehistoric monster, the kind you read about in ancient myths. Its body seemed to coil beneath the surface, powerful, but its head was staring straight at us. For a moment, time stood still. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. The creature hovered above us, its massive body cutting through the water as though it had no care for anything around it. Its eyes, those dark, ancient eyes, watched us, unblinking, as if deciding what to do with us. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it plunged back beneath the surface, vanishing into the dark depths of the loch. We sat there, silent, for what felt like an eternity. The boat was still rocking gently from the disturbance, but there were no more ripples, no signs of movement. Only the quiet, eerie mist and the dark, endless water surrounding us. I couldn't believe what I'd just seen. I still don't. "Need to go," Claire said, her voice trembling. She grabbed the motor, starting it with shaking hands. The boat jerked forward, heading back toward the shore, but neither of us said a word. We just kept our eyes on the water, expecting something to rise from it at any moment. When we finally reached the dock, we didn't look back. The locals were watching us curiously as we got out of the boat, but neither Claire nor I could find the words to describe what we had seen. The Loch Ness Monster? Maybe. But I'll never know for sure. What I do know is that whatever it was real. It wasn't a myth, and it was watching us. It was supposed to be a peaceful trip, a quiet getaway to the Scottish Highlands, a chance to disconnect from the noise of daily life. My friends, Sam and Claire, had always wanted to visit Loch Ness, and I wasn't about to say no. The place had its legends, sure, but I'd never put much stock in them. I considered myself a skeptic when it came to creatures like Nessie. We stayed in a small rustic cabin on the edge of the loch. It was the perfect place to unwind, surrounded by thick forests and the sound of the water lapping against the shore. The first few days were everything we had hoped for. Long walks, good food, and plenty of time to enjoy the stunning views. On the fourth night, after dinner, we decided to take a walk along the shore. The air was cool, and a light mist had started to roll in from the water, cloaking the world in an eerie, soft haze. It felt like something out of a ghost story, the kind of atmosphere that made you look over your shoulder just to be sure you were alone. We strolled down a narrow path that led to a small wooden dock. The water was unusually still, almost unnervingly so. I'd been told that the loch's depth could create strange currents, but tonight it seemed like the entire loch had gone silent. Sam, ever the enthusiast, was the first to notice the movement in the water. "Did you see that?" he asked, squinting into the distance. "There's something out there." I laughed. Probably just some fish or a branch, but Claire, who had been quiet until now, suddenly spoke up. "No, it's not a fish. It's something bigger." I turned to her. Her voice was strained, her eyes fixed on the dark expanse of the loch. My heart skipped. Something in her tone sent a shiver down my spine. I looked out at the water. At first, I couldn't make out anything, but then I saw it. A shape, large and dark, moving slowly through the mist just beneath the surface. It wasn't a branch or a floating log, and this was something alive, something massive. The shape was long, undulating as though it was swimming beneath the water, but its presence made the loch seem impossibly deep. My breath caught in my throat. "What the hell is that?" Sam whispered. We all stood frozen, watching as the shape drew closer to the shore. The mist parted for a brief moment, and I saw it more clearly. A long, serpentine neck rising from the water, followed by a dark, hulking shape. It was huge. Its body was sleek, glistening in the dim light. The thing's head was like nothing I'd ever seen before, reptilian, with piercing yellow eyes that seemed to lock onto mine from across the water. I couldn't breathe. The creature's gaze seemed to hold me in place as if it were sizing me up, deciding whether or not to approach. My heart pounded in my chest. My hands felt cold, clammy. I wanted to turn away, to run, but I couldn't move. The creature remained still for a moment, as though waiting for something. The silence between us felt like an eternity. Then it slowly dipped back beneath the surface, the ripples spreading outward in calm circles. It didn't leave. It just sank back into the depths as though it had never existed. I could still feel the weight of its presence lingering in the air. It was like the Loch Ness Monster had just shown me that it existed, only to disappear without a trace. We didn't speak for a long time. The air was thick with tension. The only sound, the faint rustling of the trees and the distant lapping of the water against the shore. Finally, Claire spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. That was Nessie. Sam nodded, his face pale. We saw it. It's real. I didn't know what to say. My rational mind screamed that it was a hoax, a trick of the light, or my imagination running wild. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. That thing was real, and it was not something I could explain away. We hurried back to the cabin, not speaking much, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The night felt colder, darker. The legend of Nessie had suddenly shifted from a mere tale to a terrifying reality. We left Loch Ness the next morning, the mist still swirling above the water, hiding whatever secrets lay beneath. I've never told anyone what we saw that night. Maybe they wouldn't believe me. Maybe I wouldn't believe myself if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. But I know one thing for sure. The Loch Ness Monster is real, and it's watching. It was supposed to be a peaceful vacation. My friends and I had planned a trip to the Scottish Highlands, a break from city life. Our rental cottage sat on the edge of Loch Ness, a place where the air was fresh and the mountains seemed to stretch on forever. We were tourists with no real intention of chasing myths, just wanting to relax by the water. On the second evening, we sat on the porch, enjoying a bottle of wine as the last light of day flickered across the loch. The water was still, almost unnaturally calm. My friend Sam, with his usual skepticism, mentioned the Loch Ness Monster, laughing it off as nothing more than a tourist trap. I didn't think much of it, but as the sun dipped below the hills, I noticed something strange on the water's surface. It wasn't the ripples from a breeze or the wake of a passing boat. No, this was something much larger, moving beneath the surface. I squinted, trying to make sense of it, and that's when I saw it. A dark, massive shape, stretching just beneath the water's surface, moving slowly but deliberately. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't a log or a boat, it was far too large, and the way it moved was wrong, fluid, almost unnatural. "Guys," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Look." Sam, Sarah, and Ben turned to look at me, but when their eyes followed mine, they saw nothing. The water was empty, perfectly still again. "Come on, you're imagining things," Sam said, rolling his eyes. "There's nothing there." But I knew what I'd seen. My pulse was racing, and for a moment I thought about going to get my camera, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the loch. Something felt terribly wrong. A few minutes passed, and I began to doubt myself. Until it happened again. The water rippled. A shape surfaced, large, dark, and unmistakable. It broke the surface just enough to reveal a long neck, twisting and undulating like a serpent. The head rose higher, the eyes, if they could be called eyes, shimmered in the fading light, hollow and menacing. This time, my friends saw it too. Sam's face went pale and Sarah gasped. Ben stumbled backward, knocking over a chair. None of us spoke. We were too stunned to move, too scared to breathe. The shape rose higher, just enough for us to see the massive body beneath the water, scales or something like them glistening in the moonlight. I can't say how long it lasted. Time seemed to stand still, but the creature moved gracefully, sliding through the water with eerie precision, never rushing, never panicked. Its enormous body seemed to stretch on for miles, disappearing into the blackness of the loch. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, it vanished. The water grew calm again, as if nothing had ever been there. For a long time, we didn't say anything. None of us had the words. Finally, Sam broke the silence. I saw it too," he muttered. I thought I was going crazy, but that was it." We didn't talk about it much after that. We stayed indoors, the atmosphere thick, with the unsaid truth. We had all seen something ancient and terrifying. The next morning, we packed up early. Our plans to stay another 2 days were forgotten, the mystery of the Loch Ness Monster too much to bear. As we drove away, I looked back at the loch one last time, feeling that cold shiver down my spine. The water, still and peaceful, held its secrets. Whatever we saw that night, whether myth, legend, or something far worse, it was out there, hiding beneath the surface, and we had seen it.